Long before the golden domes of Kiev pierced the sky, or the mighty Volga carried the whispers of empire, the story of what would become medieval Russia began in the vast ancient forests and sprawling river plains of Eastern Europe, a land where the East Slavs slowly began to weave their destiny. Imagine, if you will, a time when the very concept of a nation was still a distant dream, when the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons, the flow of rivers, and the rustling leaves of primeval woodlands. It was here, in the heart of the continent, roughly between the 6th and 8th centuries CE, that these nascent communities first started to coalesce, their lives intimately intertwined with the natural world around them. The earliest East Slavs were not a monolithic people, but rather a collection of tribes, each with its own customs, dialects, and territorial claims. They were farmers, hunters, and gatherers. Their settlements often nestled along the banks of rivers like the Dnieper, the Dniester, and the Western Dvina, waterways that would later serve as vital arteries of trade and communication. These rivers, much like ancient highways, connected disparate communities, allowing for the slow exchange of goods, ideas, and even marriage alliances. Their homes were simple, often semi-subterranean dwellings, designed to offer protection from the harsh winters and the heat of summer. Life was communal, centered around the family and the clan, with decisions often made by elders or tribal councils. Evidence of their early presence comes to us through archaeological finds, pottery shards, remnants of tools, burial mounds known as kurgans, which paint a picture of a people slowly transitioning from a nomadic existence to more settled agricultural practices. Historians and linguists, tracing the evolution of Slavic languages, place the ancestral homeland of the Proto-Slavs further west, perhaps in the region of modern-day Poland and Ukraine. From there, a series of migrations, driven by population growth, climate shifts, and the pressures of neighboring peoples, led to their expansion eastward, eventually differentiating into the West, South, and East Slavic branches. The East Slavs, our focus, moved into the forest steppe zone, gradually absorbing or displacing earlier inhabitants, including various Finno-Ugric tribes, whose linguistic echoes can still be found in some place names and loanwords in Russian. One of the enduring mysteries surrounding the early East Slavs is the precise nature of their social and political organization before the arrival of the Varangians. Were they truly stateless, a collection of independent tribes? Or were there nascent forms of chieftaincies or proto-states emerging organically? Classical Roman and Byzantine sources offer tantalizing but often frustratingly brief glimpses. Procopius, a Byzantine historian of the 6th century, describes the Sclaveni and Antes, often identified as early Slavs, as living in scattered settlements. Not governed by one man, but they live in a democracy, and consequently they always discuss their public affairs together. While this suggests a decentralized, egalitarian society, it might also reflect a lack of understanding from an outsider accustomed to imperial structures. The archaeological record, while rich in material culture, rarely speaks directly to political hierarchies, leaving much to scholarly debate. Some argue that the sheer scale of the later Kievan Rus state implies some pre-existing capacity for organization, while others contend that the Varangians provided the crucial catalyst for state formation. Their spiritual world was deeply rooted in animism and polytheism, a reverence for the forces of nature. The sun, the sky, the earth, and the rivers were imbued with sacred power. They worshipped deities associated with thunder, Perun, fertility, Makosh, and the harvest, often through outdoor rituals sacrifices, and the veneration of sacred trees or groves. Roves. Belief in household spirits and forest dwellers was widespread, shaping their daily lives and their relationship with the environment. Death was not an end, but a transition, often accompanied by elaborate burial rites, including the construction of kurgans, which sometimes contained grave goods to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. These practices, though gradually supplanted by Christianity, left an indelible mark on the folk traditions and superstitions that persisted for centuries. The slow consolidation of these scattered East Slavic tribes was not a peaceful process. Intertribal conflicts were common, often fueled by disputes over land, resources, or raiding opportunities. However, a more significant external force began to exert pressure from the south and east: the Khazars. This Turkic people, who established a powerful khaganate in the 7th century, controlled vast territories stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Dnieper. The Khazars uniquely converted to Judaism in the 8th or 9th century, creating a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that served as a crucial intermediary between Byzantium, the Islamic world, and the Slavic lands. Many East Slavic tribes, particularly those in the southern regions, fell under Khazar suzerainty, paying tribute in furs, honey, and slaves. This interaction, though often exploitative, also exposed the Slavs to more sophisticated forms of governance, trade networks, and military organization. Yet it was from the north, across the Baltic Sea, that another powerful influence began to emerge, one that would fundamentally reshape the destiny of the East Slavs: the Varangians. These were Norsemen, Vikings from Scandinavia, driven by a thirst for trade, plunder, and new lands. Unlike their Western counterparts, who raided and settled in England, France, and Iceland, the Eastern Vikings, whom the Slavs called Varangians, meaning oath-bound men or fellows, focused their attention on the rich river systems of Eastern Europe. They were not merely warriors. They were shrewd merchants and skilled navigators, drawn by the allure of the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, a network of rivers and portages connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and ultimately to the glittering markets of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Beginning in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, small bands of Varangian traders and warriors began to penetrate the East Slavic lands. They established trading posts, often fortified, along the major rivers, particularly the Volkhov, the Lovat, and the Dnieper. These posts, like Ladoga and later Novgorod, served as crucial hubs for the exchange of goods: furs, amber, honey, wax, and slaves from the Slavic interior were traded for silver dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate, Byzantine silks, and Frankish weaponry. The Varangians, with their superior shipbuilding technology and military prowess, quickly established dominance over these trade routes, often extracting tolls and tributes from the local Slavic populations. The arrival of the Varangians is a pivotal moment in the foundational myths of Kievan Rus, encapsulated in the Tale of Bygone Years, also known as the Primary Chronicle. This seminal historical document, compiled in the early 12th century by monks in Kiev, recounts the legendary invitation of the Varangians by the Slavic tribes. According to the chronicle, around the year 862 CE, the East Slavic tribes, weary of internal strife and unable to govern themselves, sent a delegation across the sea to the Varangians, proclaiming, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." In response, Three Varangian brothers, Rurik, Cineas, and Truvor, arrived. Rurik settled in Ladoga, then moved to Novgorod, establishing a dynasty that would rule for centuries. His brothers, according to the chronicle, settled in other towns. This invitation of the Varangians has been a subject. Topic of intense scholarly debate for centuries, forming the core of what is known as the Normanist controversy. Normanists argue that the Varangians, with their advanced organizational skills and military strength, were the primary architects of the early East Slavic state, providing the ruling elite and the very name Rus. Anti-Normanists, on the other hand, contend that the Slavic tribes were already developing their own political structures, and that the Varangians merely integrated into existing societies, perhaps as mercenaries or traders who seized power, rather than being invited to create a state from scratch. They point to the fact that the Varangians quickly adopted Slavic language and customs, suggesting a more fluid integration than a pure conquest. While the invitation might be a romanticized simplification, it is undeniable that the Varangians played a crucial role in the consolidation of power and the formation of a unified political entity. Rurik and his successors, notably Oleg, who is said to have moved south and seized Kiev around 882 CE, began to unite the disparate Slavic tribes under their rule. Oleg's conquest of Kiev is often considered the symbolic birth of Kievan Rus, as he declared Kiev the mother of Rus cities. This strategic move placed the nascent state firmly on the Dnieper River, controlling the vital trade route to Constantinople. Under Oleg and his successors, the Varangian rulers, now increasingly Slavicized, began to establish a more formal system of governance. They collected tribute from the subjugated tribes, organized military campaigns against neighboring peoples, including the Khazars and the Byzantines, and forged treaties that secured favorable trade terms. The name Rus, itself of disputed origin, but widely believed to be derived from a Norse word referring to rowers or a specific group of Norsemen, came to designate not just the ruling elite, but eventually the entire territory and its people. This process of state building was gradual, marked by both coercion and accommodation, as the Varangian elite slowly merged with the local Slavic aristocracy. The early Kievan Rus was a fascinating blend of Norse military organization, Slavic agricultural practices, and Byzantine cultural influence. The rulers, though of Varangian descent, increasingly adopted Slavic names and customs, becoming indistinguishable from the local elite over a few generations. The language of administration and culture remained Slavic, though Old Norse undoubtedly left its mark on early vocabulary. The capital Kiev grew into a bustling trade center, a crossroads where goods and ideas from Scandinavia, Byzantium, and the Islamic world converged. Wooden fortresses protected the burgeoning towns, and the sounds of various languages mingled in the marketplaces. As the 10th century dawned, Kievan Rus was not yet the powerful Christian empire it would become, but it was a rapidly expanding and increasingly sophisticated polity. Its rulers, like Igor and his formidable wife Olga, continued to consolidate power, suppressing rebellions and expanding their dominion. The focus remained on controlling the lucrative trade routes and extracting tribute, but the seeds of a more complex societal structure were being sown. The foundational myths of the East Slavs, of their ancient lands, and the arrival of the Varangians laid the groundwork for a rich and complex history, a narrative that would unfold over centuries of triumphs, tribulations, and transformations, echoing across the vast plains and deep forests of Eastern Europe. Perhaps these early settlements, with their flickering hearth fires and the distant cries of wolves, whispered stories to the stars, stories of a future empire yet to be born. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and leave in the comments the time and place you're listening from. The river, a silent witness to countless sunrises and sunsets, continued its southward journey, carrying with it the echoes of a nascent state. From the scattered tribal settlements along its banks, a more cohesive entity began to emerge, coalescing around the strategic Dnieper trade route. The foundation of this new power, Kievan Rus, was not a sudden upheaval, but a gradual weaving together of diverse threads: Norse ambition, Slavic resilience, and the allure of Byzantine wealth. The city of Kiev, perched high on its hills, became the beating heart of this burgeoning realm, its wooden palisades and bustling markets a testament to a growing prosperity. The early Rurikid princes, descendants of the legendary Rurik, were shrewd navigators of this complex landscape. They understood the power of both the sword and the treaty, forging alliances with some tribes while subjugating others. Their longships, brave drivers, set foot against the frays of King of Russia and backed their presence and destiny, unconfined by Rurik's service and kindness. More importantly, they made sure to avoid the devastating power of the social state. The city of Kiev, perched high on its hills, became the beating heart of this burgeoning realm, its wooden palisades and bustling markets a testament to a growing prosperity. Once instruments of raid and plunder, now served as vessels of commerce, carrying furs, honey, and wax down to the Black Sea and the glittering markets of Constantinople. This connection to the Byzantine Empire was more than just economic. It was a cultural lifeline, bringing new ideas, new technologies, and eventually a new faith to the wild lands of the north. One of the most pivotal figures in this early history was Sviatoslav I, a warrior prince who, in the mid-10th century, epitomized the martial spirit of his Norse ancestors. He preferred the open field to the comforts of a palace, often sleeping on a saddle blanket with a stone for a pillow. His campaigns were legendary, extending the reach of Rus power far to the east and south, clashing with the Khazars and even daring to challenge the mighty Byzantine Empire. He was a man of action, his very name a byword for courage and ferocity. Yet, despite his military prowess, Sviatoslav remained deeply rooted in the old pagan traditions, a stark contrast to the Christian fervor that was slowly permeating the region. His life, a whirlwind of conquest, ended tragically in an ambush by the Pechenegs, a nomadic people of the steppe, a constant threat on the southern frontier. His skull, it is said, was fashioned into a drinking cup by the Pecheneg Khan, a grim testament to the brutal realities of the time. Sviatoslav's death left a power vacuum, leading to a period of internecine strife among his sons. It was from this crucible of conflict that Vladimir Sviatoslavich, later known as Vladimir the Great, emerged. His early reign was marked by the same pagan practices as his father, including the erection of idols and the continuation of human sacrifice. Yet Vladimir was also a pragmatic ruler, keenly aware of the need for a unifying force within his diverse realm. He observed the sophisticated societies around him, noting the powerful influence of religion in both the Islamic East and the Christian South. The tale of Vladimir's conversion to Christianity, around 988 CE, is often recounted with a blend of historical fact and legendary embellishment. It is said that he sent envoys to various neighboring lands to study their faiths. The reports were varied. The Volga Bulgars' Islam lacked joy. The Germans' Catholicism was too austere, and the Khazars' Judaism was too isolated. But when his envoys returned from Constantinople, they spoke of the awe-inspiring beauty of the Hagia Sophia, describing a divine liturgy that transcended earthly experience. "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth," they reportedly declared. This encounter, whether entirely literal or embellished over centuries, profoundly impacted Vladimir. He understood that adopting a monotheistic religion, particularly one as grand and established as Eastern Orthodoxy, would not only provide spiritual unity but also elevate Kievan Rus in the eyes of the world. His conversion was not merely a personal spiritual journey. It was a calculated political maneuver. By embracing orthodoxy, Vladimir aligned Kievan Rus with the most powerful and cultured empire of the age, gaining access to Byzantine art, architecture, law, and scholarship. He sealed this alliance by marrying Anna Porphyrogenita, a Byzantine princess, a remarkable feat for a barbarian prince. This marriage not only legitimized his rule, but also brought a direct infusion of Byzantine culture into Kiev. Upon his return, Vladimir systematically destroyed pagan idols, ordered mass baptisms in the Dnieper, and began the construction of churches, most notably the Church of the Tithes in Kiev, the first stone church in Rus. This act of conversion, often referred to as the baptism of Rus, was a watershed moment, forever altering the trajectory of East Slavic civilization. It laid the spiritual and cultural groundwork for what would become the Russian Orthodox Church, an institution that would profoundly shape national identity for centuries to come. Vladimir's reign, spanning from approximately 980 to 1015 CE, marked the true beginning of Kievan Rus as a unified and Christian state. He established a system of administration, minted coins, and encouraged trade. He was a complex figure, a pagan warrior who became a saint, a ruthless ruler who embraced a faith of peace. His legacy was not just in the adoption of Christianity, but in the creation of a more stable and internationally recognized state. Following Vladimir's death, another period of succession struggles ensued among his many sons. This was a recurring theme in early Rus history, as the concept of primogeniture, inheritance by the eldest son, was not yet firmly established. Instead, a system of lateral succession, where the throne passed to the eldest living male of the ruling dynasty, often led to bitter conflicts. Historians still debate the precise nature of this rota system and its impact on political stability. Was it a deliberate strategy to ensure experienced rulers, or simply a pragmatic response to a large princely family? Regardless, it often resulted in bloodshed and fragmentation. It was Yaroslav Vladimirovich, later known as Yaroslav the Wise, who ultimately triumphed in these struggles, consolidating power and ushering in what is widely considered the golden age of Kievan Rus. His reign, from 1019 to 1054 CE, was a period of unprecedented cultural flourishing and political stability. Yaroslav was a man of intellect and vision, a stark contrast to the purely martial figures who preceded him. He understood that true power lay not just in military might, but in law, education, and international diplomacy. One of Yaroslav's most significant achievements was the compilation of the Russkaya Pravda, Russian justice, the first written legal code of Kievan Rus. This comprehensive set of laws, drawing on Slavic customary law and Byzantine legal principles, provided a framework for justice, regulating everything from property rights to criminal offences. It was a remarkable step towards a more ordered society, replacing arbitrary tribal customs with a codified system. The Russkaya Pravda reflects the social structure of the time, with different penalties for crimes against various social classes, and notably, it replaced blood vengeance with monetary fines, a sign of a more sophisticated legal system. Under Yaroslav, Kiev blossomed into a magnificent city, rivaling even Constantinople in its splendor. He initiated ambitious building projects, most notably the majestic St. Sophia Cathedral, consecrated in 1037 CE. This architectural marvel, with its 13 gleaming domes and intricate mosaics, was not merely a place of worship, but a symbol of Kievan Rus's wealth, power, and cultural sophistication. Inside, the walls whispered stories in vibrant tesserae, depicting saints, emperors, and biblical scenes, educating and inspiring the populace. It was a testament to the profound influence of Byzantine art and architecture, adapted and imbued with a distinct Rus character. Yaroslav also established schools and libraries, encouraging literacy and the translation of Greek texts into Old Church Slavonic. He understood the importance of knowledge in building a strong state. Monasteries, such as the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra cave monastery, founded during his reign, became centers of learning and spiritual devotion, preserving chronicles and fostering artistic traditions. This emphasis on education and the written word was crucial for the development of a distinct Rus literary tradition. Diplomacy was another cornerstone of Yaroslav's policy. He skillfully forged alliances through strategic marriages, marrying his daughters to kings and princes across Europe. Anna to King Henry I of France, Anastasia to King Andrew I of Hungary, and Elizabeth to King Harold III of Norway. These marital ties integrated Kievan Rus into the broader European political landscape, raising its international prestige and securing its borders. Kiev became a hub of international exchange, a vibrant crossroads where East met West. The stories of these princesses journeying to distant lands speak to the interconnectedness of medieval Europe, even in an age of difficult travel. The golden age of Yaroslav the Wise was a period of relative peace and prosperity, a time when Kievan Rus stood as a formidable power, a beacon of culture and learning in Eastern Europe. The Dnieper continued to flow, but now its waters reflected not just the sky, but the grandeur of stone cathedrals and the bustling life of a thriving capital. The memory of pagan gods faded, replaced by the resonant chants of Orthodox liturgy. Yet the deep connection to the land and its ancient rhythms remained. However, even during this zenith, the seeds of future fragmentation were being sown. Yaroslav, in an attempt to prevent the destructive succession struggles that had plagued his predecessors, devised a system of inheritance for his sons, known as the Lestvichno Pravo, or ladder law. This system dictated that the eldest son would inherit the throne of Kiev, and as older brothers died, the younger ones would move up the ladder to more important principalities, eventually reaching Kiev. While intended to ensure a smooth transition, in practice, this system often led to intense rivalry and conflict among the princes. Each prince, eager to ascend the ladder, would often jockey for position, forming alliances and engaging in skirmishes, weakening the central authority of Kiev over time. The vastness of Kievan Rus also contributed to its eventual decentralization. The sheer distances between principalities, coupled with the rudimentary communication and transportation of the era, made it difficult for Kiev to exert absolute control over its far-flung territories. Local boyars, the landowning aristocracy, grew in power and influence, often aligning themselves with various princes to further their own interests. Moreover, the constant threat from nomadic peoples on the southern steppe, particularly the Pechenegs and later the Cumans, Polovsi, drained resources and manpower. These incursions forced princes to maintain strong regional armies, further empowering them and sometimes leading them to act independently of Kiev. The southern frontier was a volatile region, a constant battleground where the settled agricultural life of Rus clashed with the mobile, horse-riding cultures of the steppe. Despite these underlying tensions, Yaroslav's reign left an indelible mark. He solidified the Christian identity of Rus, fostered a rich cultural heritage, and established a legal and administrative framework that would endure for centuries. The image of Kiev in this era is one of a vibrant, sophisticated city, its markets filled with goods from distant lands, its churches echoing with hymns, and its schools nurturing a new generation of scholars. Perhaps these walls whispered stories to the stars of a time when a new civilization found its voice, blending Norse vigor with Slavic spirit and Byzantine grandeur. The decline of the Golden Age was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual erosion of central authority. After Yaroslav's death, the Lesvichne Pravo proved to be more of a catalyst for conflict than a guarantor of peace. His sons and grandsons, each vying for the coveted throne of Kiev, engaged in a series of internecine wars. These conflicts weakened the state, diverted resources, and made it vulnerable to external threats. The once unified realm began to splinter into increasingly independent principalities. Chernigov, Pereyaslav, Smolensk, Polotsk, and later Vladimir Suzdal and Galicia Volhynia. Each principality developed its own distinct political and cultural characteristics, often at odds with its neighbours. The economic landscape also shifted. While the Dnieper trade route remained important, its significance began to wane as new trade routes emerged and the Byzantine Empire itself faced internal challenges and external pressures. The constant warfare disrupted commerce and agricultural production, further contributing to the decline of Kiev's preeminence. By the 12th century, the title of Grand Prince of Kiev, though still prestigious, no longer carried the same absolute authority it once did. Princes often held the title for short periods, constantly challenged by their ambitious relatives. The political center of gravity began to shift northward, away from the vulnerable southern steppe and towards the forested lands of the northeast, particularly to the burgeoning principality of Vladimir Suzdal. This region, less exposed to nomadic incursions and possessing fertile lands, offered a new locus of power. The story of Kievan Rus is a testament to the dynamic interplay of cultural assimilation, political ambition, and geographic realities. From its humble origins as a collection of tribal settlements, it rose to become a powerful and culturally rich state, a bridge between East and West. The legacy of Vladimir the Great and Yaroslav the Wise, in particular, shaped the religious, legal, and cultural identity of the East Slavs. laying the foundations for the future Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian nations. Yet, like all great civilizations, Kievan Rus was subject to the inexorable forces of change, its golden age eventually giving way to a period of fragmentation and regionalization. The grand vision of a unified realm, however, would continue to echo through the centuries, inspiring future rulers and shaping the historical consciousness of the lands it once encompassed. The river flowed on, carrying whispers of past glories and the promise of new beginnings, as the tapestry of history continued to unfold. The grand tapestry of Kievan Rus, woven with Yaroslav's careful threads of law and learning, began to fray soon after his passing in 1054. The very principles he had championed, a unified realm, a succession based on seniority, proved brittle against the relentless human currents of ambition and kinship. His sons, each a prince in his own right, inherited not a single unshakable throne, but a complex web of claims and expectations. This was not a simple division, but a deliberate system Yaroslav had envisioned, known as the Rota system, or ladder of succession, where brothers and cousins were meant to move up a hierarchical ladder of principalities, eventually reaching the coveted throne of Kiev. The eldest surviving member of the dynasty was meant to rule the capital, while younger relatives governed lesser towns, awaiting their turn. In theory, it was designed to prevent fratricide by offering a clear path to power. In practice, it often fueled it. Imagine a vast chessboard, with each principality a square, and each prince a piece, constantly maneuvering for a better position. The pieces, however, were not inanimate. They were living men, with armies, allies, and burning desires. Yaroslav's three eldest sons, Izyaslav, Sviatoslav, and Vsevolod, initially formed a triumvirate, attempting to uphold their father's legacy. For a time, they even collaborated on a new legal code, the Pravda Yaroslavichi, expanding upon their father's laws, a testament to their initial shared purpose. But the delicate balance was easily disturbed. The death of one brother, the perceived slight of another, the whispers of ambitious boyars, all could ignite a spark. The first major tremor came with the Polovtsians, nomadic Turkic warriors who had replaced the Pechenegs on the southern steppes. These formidable horsemen, masters of hit-and-run tactics, began to raid Rus lands with increasing frequency, their swift incursions a constant threat to the rich agricultural regions and trade routes. In 1068, a combined force of the three brothers suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of the Polovtsians on the Alta River. This military failure had immediate political repercussions. The people of Kiev, already restless and burdened by princely feuds, rose up in protest, demanding arms to defend themselves, and even briefly expelling Izyaslav, the Grand Prince, from the city. This incident, while quickly quelled, was a chilling harbinger of the instability to come. It showed that the Grand Prince's authority was not absolute, and that the populace, when pushed, could exert its own will. The Rota system, meant to ensure a peaceful transfer of power, instead became a perpetual source of contention. Princes, rather than patiently waiting their turn, often sought to accelerate their ascent through alliances, treachery, and open warfare. Each principality, with its own burgeoning economy and military, became a potential power base for a prince seeking to challenge the established order. The concept of a unified Rus began to fracture, not into separate nations, but into a collection of semi-independent principalities, each vying for dominance, yet still bound by a shared language, religion, and dynastic lineage. The Dnieper, once the unifying artery of the realm, now often served as a battleground or a boundary between warring kin. The sounds of church bells, once a symbol of spiritual unity, were increasingly drowned out by the clang of swords and the cries of raiding parties. The very landscape, once seen as a shared inheritance, became a contested prize. One of the most persistent and destructive conflicts arose from the ambitions of Oleg Sviatoslavich, a grandson of Yaroslav, known as Oleg Gorislavich, the Sorrowful One, by the chroniclers for the endless strife he brought. He embodied the destructive potential of the Rota system's flaws. Denied what he believed was his rightful inheritance, he repeatedly sought to seize power, often in allying with the very Polovtsians who threatened Rus lands. His actions, and those of many other princes, led to a cycle of internecine warfare that drained Rus of its strength and resources. Castles were besieged, towns were burned, and the common people suffered immensely under the constant threat of war and plunder. The rich agricultural lands of the south, particularly around Kiev, were frequently devastated, leading to famine and displacement. Historians still debate whether this fragmentation was an inevitable consequence of Yaroslav's succession system, or if it was primarily driven by the personal failings and boundless ambitions of his descendants. Perhaps the sheer size of Kievan Rus, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, made centralized control inherently difficult in an age of slow communication and travel. The diverse ethnic groups within its borders, Slavs, Finno-Ugrians, Balts, while largely assimilated, also contributed to a less homogeneous realm than, say, the kingdoms of Western Europe. As Kiev's grip weakened, new centers of power began to emerge, each with its own distinct character and trajectory. Two of these, Novgorod in the north and Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast, would become particularly prominent, shaping the future of the eastern Slavic lands in profound ways. Novgorod, nestled in the dense forests and marshlands near Lake Ilmen, was a city of merchants and craftsmen, a vital hub on the great river trade routes connecting the Baltic to the Byzantine Empire. Its unique geography, far from the southern steppes, offered a measure of protection from nomadic incursions, allowing it to develop a distinct political identity. While nominally part of Kievan Rus, Novgorod enjoyed an unusual degree of autonomy, a kind of proto-republican structure that set it apart. The power in Novgorod was not concentrated solely in the hands of a prince. Instead, a powerful assembly, the Vicha, composed of free male citizens, held significant sway. This Vicha could elect its own prince, invite him to rule, or even expel him if he displeased them. They also appointed the Posadnik, a chief magistrate, and the Tisyatsky, a military commander, who often held more real power than the prince himself. The prince, in Novgorod, was primarily a military leader and a judicial figure, but his authority was always subject to the will of the Vicha. This was an extraordinary arrangement for medieval Europe, where monarchical rule was the norm. Imagine a bustling marketplace, not just for goods, but for ideas and political decisions, where the voices of the people, or at least a significant portion of them, could directly influence the city's fate. The great bell of the Vicha, when it rang, summoned the citizens to debate and decide, a sound that must have echoed with a sense of collective power. The wealth of Novgorod flowed from its extensive trade networks. Furs from the vast northern forests, wax, honey, timber, and slaves were exchanged for fine cloths, metals, and luxury goods from Europe and Byzantium. Its merchants were renowned for their enterprise, establishing trading posts far and wide. The city's unique political system and economic prowess allowed it to flourish even as Kiev declined, becoming a powerful, independent entity, a true Lord Novgorod the Great. Meanwhile, in the northeastern forests, another power was slowly but steadily rising, the Principality of Vladimir Suzdal. This region, initially a sparsely populated frontier, began to attract settlers from the south, fleeing the constant Polovtsian raids and the incessant princely feuds. The dense forests offered natural defences, and the fertile river valleys provided rich agricultural land. This migration, a slow but steady trickle of people, brought with them skills, traditions, and a desire for stability. The princes of Vladimir Suzdal, often younger sons or less prominent members of the Rurikid dynasty, found themselves in a unique position. Unlike the princes of Kiev, who were constantly entangled in the complex politics of the Dnieper region, these northern princes had the opportunity to build their power base relatively unhindered. They focused on developing their lands, founding new towns, and consolidating their authority. One of the most significant figures in the rise of Vladimir Suzdal was Yuri Dolgoruki, Yuri the Long-Armed, so named for his ambition to reach out and control lands far beyond his immediate domain. He was a son of Vladimir Monomakh, one of the more successful Grand Princes of Kiev, who had temporarily managed to restore some semblance of order to Rus in the early 12th century. Yuri, however, spent much of his life warring for the Kievan throne, often successfully, but never holding it for long. Yet it was in the northeast that his true legacy lay. He founded numerous towns, including Moscow, in 1147, initially a small fortified settlement at the confluence of rivers, which would one day become the heart of a vast empire. He invested in infrastructure, building churches and fortresses, laying the groundwork for a powerful new principality. His son, Andrei Bogolubsky, Andrei the God-loving, took the development of Vladimir Suzdal to new heights. Andrei was a prince of immense ambition and ruthlessness. He famously sacked Kiev in 1169, not to claim the throne and reside there, but to plunder its riches and diminish its prestige, carrying away icons and treasures. This act was a symbolic turning point, marking the definitive shift of power away from Kiev. It was an unprecedented act of violence by one Rus prince against another, a stark illustration of how far the concept of a unified Rus had eroded. Andrei then established his capital at Vladimir, transforming it into a magnificent city, adorned with stunning white stone cathedrals, like the Dormition Cathedral and the Church of the Intercession on the Nerl, architectural masterpieces that still stand today, testament to his vision and the wealth of his principality. Andrei sought to create a new spiritual and political center in the northeast, deliberately distancing himself from the traditional authority of Kiev. He even attempted to establish a separate metropolitanate for his lands, independent of the metropolitan in Kiev, though this effort ultimately failed. He ruled with a firm hand, often clashing with the powerful boyars of his realm, who eventually conspired against him and assassinated him in 1174. His death, however, did not halt the rise of Vladimir Suzdal. His brother Vsevolod, the Big Nest, so called for his numerous children, continued to consolidate power, further strengthening the principality and extending its influence. The shift in power from Kiev to these new centers was not a sudden cataclysm, but a gradual, almost organic process, driven by a confluence of factors: the Polotzian threat pushing people northward, the economic opportunities of new trade routes, and the relentless ambition of individual princes. The once bright beacon of Kiev, though still revered as the spiritual heart of Rus, became increasingly a prize to be fought over, rather than a stable seat of power. Its rich lands, once its strength, became its vulnerability, constantly exposed to raids and internal strife. While these new centers flourished, the southern principalities, particularly those along the Dnieper, continued to suffer from the constant internecine warfare and nomadic incursions. The Principality of Galicia-Volhynia in the southwest also rose to prominence, developing its own unique blend of Rus and Central European influences, often engaging in complex diplomatic and military maneuvers with its Polish and Hungarian neighbors. Its princes, like Danilo Romanovich, would later play a crucial role in defending Rus lands against new threats. The internal divisions, however, were deep-seated. The princes, despite their shared ancestry and faith, often seemed incapable of sustained cooperation. The chroniclers frequently lamented this state of affairs, seeing it as a sign of divine displeasure and a source of weakness. They recorded numerous princely congresses, attempts to forge peace and unity, but these often proved fleeting, with agreements broken as soon as it served a prince's immediate interest. The famous Congress of Lübeck in 1097, for instance, saw princes swear an oath: let each hold his patrimony, an attempt to stabilize land ownership and reduce conflict. Yet even this solemn vow was soon violated, leading to further bloodshed. This period of fragmentation, stretching from the mid-11th century to the early 13th century, was a time of immense change and turmoil for the lands of Rus. The grand, unified vision of Vladimir the Great and Yaroslav the Wise had dissolved into a mosaic of competing principalities. Yet within this fragmentation, new identities and strengths were forged. Novgorod, with its republican spirit, and Vladimir Suzdal, with its autocratic ambitions, were laying the foundations for distinct future paths. The sounds of construction, of new cathedrals and fortifications, mingled with the echoes of battle, as the people of Rus adapted to a world where their grand prince was no longer a singular, all-powerful figure, but one among many, each asserting their own claim to destiny. The forests whispered of a changing world, and the rivers, though still flowing to the sea, now carried the stories of many different Russes, each with its own dreams and struggles. The winds of change, often heralded by the distant thunder of hooves, were gathering on the vast eastern steppes. For centuries, the nomadic peoples of these grasslands had been a persistent, if often localized, threat to the settled agricultural societals along their borders. But what was coming now was different. It was a storm unlike any seen before, born from the unification of disparate tribes under a single, indomitable will, that of Genghis Khan. His vision, forged in the crucible of personal hardship and strategic brilliance, was to unite the world under the eternal blue sky. And his descendants were poised to carry this vision westward. The Ruslands, fragmented and often squabbling amongst themselves, were ill-prepared for such a force. Their princes, accustomed to raiding each other's territories and vying for the prestigious throne of Kiev, saw the distant reports of strange, swift horsemen as little more than another barbarian incursion, albeit a particularly successful one against their Polovtsian neighbours. Indeed, in 1223, a coalition of Rus princes, responding to an appeal from the beleaguered Polovtsi, met the Mongol vanguard at the Battle of the Kalka River. It was a catastrophic defeat. The Rus forces, disorganized and lacking a unified command, were utterly routed by the disciplined and innovative Mongol tactics. The battle was a grim foreshadowing, a taste of the tempest yet to come. But the princes, perhaps lulled by the Mongols' subsequent withdrawal, failed to grasp its full significance. They returned to their internecine squabbles, the memory of Kalka fading into the background of more immediate local concerns. 15 years later, the storm broke in earnest. In 1237, Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, led a massive Mongol army across the Volga River. This was no mere raiding party. This was a meticulously planned invasion aimed at conquest. The winter of 1237 to 1238 was particularly harsh, but the frozen rivers and swamps, usually natural defenses, now served as superhighways for the Mongol cavalry. Ryazan was the first major city to fall, after a brutal siege. Its inhabitants, according to chronicles, were put to the sword, and the city razed. The message was clear and terrifying: resist and face annihilation. One by one, the cities of northeastern Rus crumbled. Kolomna, Moscow, Vladimir, Suzdal, all fell to the relentless Mongol assault. The grandeur of Vladimir, with its magnificent Golden Gate and Dormition Cathedral, was reduced to ashes. Its princely family, along with many inhabitants, perished in the flames of the cathedral where they had sought refuge. The Mongols were masters of siege warfare, employing Chinese engineers and sophisticated trebuchets to breach even the strongest fortifications. Their speed, discipline, and sheer ferocity were unmatched. The winter campaigns were particularly devastating. The cities, unprepared for such a swift and coordinated attack, fell in rapid succession. Novgorod, the wealthy northern mercantile republic, was spared the direct devastation, perhaps due to the spring thaws that turned the landscape into impassable mud. Or perhaps because the Mongols, having achieved their primary objectives in the richer southern and central lands, decided to turn back. However, its submission and tribute would soon follow. Kiev, the ancient mother of Rus cities, met its tragic fate in 1240. After a prolonged siege, the city walls were breached, and its inhabitants suffered a terrible massacre. The once thriving metropolis, a beacon of Orthodox Christianity and culture, was left in ruins, its magnificent churches plundered and desecrated. The destruction of Kiev marked a symbolic end to the Kievan Rus era, effectively shifting the center of gravity of Russian history northward, towards the forest lands and nascent principalities like Moscow. The Mongol invasion was not just a military conquest, it was a societal cataclysm. Estimates vary, but some historians believe that a significant portion of the population perished, either in battle, during sieges, or from the subsequent famine and disease. Cities, the hubs of craft, trade, and culture, were devastated. The intricate network of trade routes that had connected Rus to Byzantium and Western Europe was disrupted. Artisans, particularly those skilled in fine metalwork, enamel, and masonry, were either killed or forcibly relocated to the Mongol capital at Sarai on the Volga, leading to a noticeable decline in the quality and quantity of certain crafts in Rus for generations. With the conquest complete, the Mongols did not directly govern the Rus lands. Instead, they established a system of indirect rule known as the Mongol Yoke. The Golden Horde, a western branch of the Mongol Empire, headquartered in Sarai, became the overlord of the Rus principalities. Russian princes were allowed to retain their thrones, but only after traveling to Sarai to receive a yarluk, or patent of authority, from the Khan. This journey was often perilous and humiliating, a stark reminder of their subservient status. The princes were effectively vassals, compelled to pay a heavy annual tribute, known as the vikhod, to the horde. The collection of this tribute was often brutal. Mongol officials, known as baskaki, were initially stationed in Rus cities to oversee the process, conducting censuses to assess taxable households and ensuring prompt payment. Resistance was met with swift and merciless reprisal. Later, some princes, particularly those of Moscow, were entrusted with collecting the tribute themselves, a role that, while initially burdensome, would eventually grant them significant power and influence over their rivals. The impact of the Mongol yoke on Russian society, politics and culture was profound and multifaceted, and historians still debate the extent to which it shaped the future trajectory of Russia. One school of thought, often termed the Eurasianist perspective, argues that the Mongol experience profoundly reoriented Russia away from Europe and towards an autocratic, centralized model of governance, imbued with a distinct Eastern character. Others emphasize the resilience of Russian culture and institutions, arguing that while the yoke was undoubtedly a period of immense suffering, it did not fundamentally alter the underlying developmental path of Rus. Certainly, the political landscape was irrevocably altered. The traditional system of succession, based on seniority within the Rurikid dynasty, was undermined. The Khan's yarluk became the ultimate source of legitimacy, allowing the Mongols to play princes against each other, favoring those who were most loyal and effective in tribute collection. This often meant that the most ambitious and ruthless princes, rather than the most senior, rose to prominence. This new political reality fostered a more authoritarian style of rule among the Rus princes, who, in dealing with their own populations, adopted some of the harsh administrative practices learned from their Mongol overlords. Economically, the yoke was a drain. The constant demand for tribute, often paid in silver and furs, impoverished the lands and hindered economic development. Trade with the West declined, though new trade routes to the east, connecting Rus to the vast Mongol network, did open up. This exposure to the east brought new goods, technologies and ideas, albeit often indirectly. The very structure of land ownership and taxation was influenced, with the Mongol system of direct taxation on households and land becoming a template for later Muscovite practices. Culturally, the impact is more subtle, but no less significant. While the Mongols themselves did not impose their religion, Tengrism, or language on the conquered peoples, their presence fostered a period of relative isolation from Western Europe. This allowed Russian Orthodoxy to solidify its position as the bedrock of Russian identity, becoming a unifying force in the face of foreign domination. The Church, often exempted from Mongol taxation, grew in wealth and influence, becoming a repository of learning and a symbol of national resilience. However, this isolation also meant that Rus missed out on some of the intellectual and artistic developments of the Renaissance in Western Europe. Linguistically, the Mongol influence is evident in a number of Russian words, particularly those related to finance, administration, and military affairs. Words like kazna, treasury, tamozhna, customs, and yanshik, post-driver, have Turkic or Mongol origins. Even some common surnames, like Karamzin, are thought to derive from Mongol or Turkic roots. One fascinating, lesser-known detail from this period concerns the fate of the Rus princely families. While many perished, others adapted. Some even married into the Mongol elite, forging complex familial ties that blurred the lines between conqueror and conquered. For instance, the family of Prince Fyodor Rostislavich the Black of Yaroslavl is said to have had close ties with the Golden Horde, with his son marrying a Mongol princess. Such alliances, while perhaps born of political necessity, illustrate the intricate web of relationships that developed under the yoke, far more complex than a simple oppressor-oppressed dynamic. The rise of Moscow during this period is a testament to shrewd diplomacy and strategic opportunism. Initially a minor principality, Moscow's princes, particularly Ivan I, known as Ivan Kalita, Moneybags, skillfully navigated the treacherous political landscape. They gained the trust of the Khans by reliably collecting tribute and suppressing rebellions among other Rus princes. In return, Moscow was often favoured. Its princes granted the right to collect tribute from other lands, which allowed them to accumulate wealth and expand their territory. Furthermore, Moscow became the de facto spiritual centre of Rus, when the Metropolitan of the Russian Orthodox Church relocated his seat there in the early 14th century, lending immense prestige and legitimacy to the nascent principality. The Mongol yoke lasted for nearly 250 years. From the 1240s until the Great Stand on the Ugra River in 1480. It was a period of immense hardship, but also one of profound transformation. The decentralized princely Rus that existed before the invasion was slowly, painfully forged into a more centralized, autocratic state under the leadership of Moscow. The experience of foreign domination instilled a deep-seated desire for unity and a strong, centralized authority capable of defending the land from external threats. The legacy of the yoke continues to be debated. Did it stunt Russia's development, pushing it onto a path distinct from Western Europe? Or did it, through the crucible of adversity, forge a unique Russian identity and state capable of enduring centuries of challenges? Historians still grapple with these questions, seeking to understand the long shadows cast by the Mongol horsemen on the vast plains of medieval Rus. What is undeniable is that the Golden Horde fundamentally reshaped the course of Russian history, leaving an indelible mark on its political structures, cultural identity, and its very sense of self. The echoes of those distant hooves, the cries from burning cities, and the weight of the Yarlik would resonate for centuries, shaping the destiny of a nation slowly, painstakingly, emerging from the ashes. As the golden age of Kiev faded into memory, a new constellation of power began to shimmer in the vast northern forests, far from the Dnieper's gentle flow. It was here, amidst the dense woods and winding rivers, that the seeds of a future empire would slowly take root. The Mongol yoke, though crushing, inadvertently fostered a unique environment for certain principalities to grow, much like resilient saplings finding light in a shadowed forest. Among these, a small, unassuming settlement named Moscow or Moskva began its quiet ascent. Its origins were humble, a mere fortified trading post, first mentioned in chronicles in 1147, when Prince Yuri Dolgoruki of Suzdal, a figure whose name means Yuri of the Long Arms, invited a princely ally to a feast there. At this time, Moscow was but a speck on the vast map of Rus, overshadowed by its more established neighbours like Vladimir and Suzdal. Yet, its location would prove to be its greatest asset. Situated at the crossroads of several important trade routes and protected by natural barriers of forest and marshland, It offered a degree of security that many other, more exposed cities lacked. This strategic position, combined with the fertile lands surrounding it, allowed Moscow to slowly accumulate wealth and population, even as the Mongol yoke pressed down. The early princes of Moscow were masters of a subtle, long-game diplomacy. Unlike their more rebellious cousins in Tver or Rostov, who often chafed openly against Mongol authority, the Muscovite rulers adopted a policy of pragmatic cooperation. They understood that direct confrontation was suicidal. Instead, they cultivated a relationship with the Golden Horde that was often perceived as subservient, but which, in reality, was a shrewd maneuver for survival and eventual dominance. This approach began to crystallize under Prince Daniel, the youngest son of Alexander Nevsky, who inherited the small principality around 1283. Daniel, a figure often overshadowed by his illustrious father, laid the groundwork for Moscow's future power not through military conquest, but through astute political maneuvering and the careful acquisition of land. He expanded Moscow's territory peacefully, often through inheritance or purchase, rather than costly wars. His son, Ivan I, known as Kalita or Moneybags, took this strategy to new heights. Ivan Kalita, who ruled from 1325 to 1340, was perhaps the most pivotal figure in Moscow's early rise. He was a man of immense cunning and ambition, cloaked in an outward humility that pleased his Mongol overlords. Kalita understood the value of appearing indispensable to the horde. He volunteered to collect the dreaded yasa, the Mongol tribute, from other Russian principalities. This seemingly burdensome task was, in fact, a brilliant stroke of policy. It allowed him to travel freely throughout Rus, assess the wealth and weaknesses of his rivals, and most importantly, skim a portion of the tribute for Moscow's own coffers before sending the rest to Sarai, the Mongol capital on the Volga. This role as chief tax collector not only enriched Moscow, but also earned Ivan the trust of the Mongol Khans. They saw him as a reliable, loyal vassal, someone who could keep the turbulent Russian lands in order. In return for his service, the Khans granted him the coveted Yarlik, the charter to rule as Grand Prince of Vladimir, a title that, while nominally Mongol-controlled, bestowed immense prestige and authority over other Russian princes. This was a critical turning point. The Grand Prince of Vladimir was traditionally seen as the senior ruler among the Russian principalities, and by securing this title, Ivan Kalita effectively shifted the center of power from Vladimir to Moscow. Ivan Kalita also shrewdly used his accumulated wealth to buy land from impoverished boyars and lesser princes, expanding Moscow's territorial base piece by piece. He attracted settlers by offering them protection from Mongol raids and lower taxes, further swelling Moscow's population and economic strength. Perhaps his most enduring legacy, however, was persuading the Metropolitan of Kiev, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, to move his seat to Moscow in 1325. The Metropolitan, Peter, had already spent considerable time in Moscow, finding it a safer and more stable haven than the often raided Kiev. This relocation was a profound symbolic victory. It transformed Moscow from a regional power into the spiritual heart of Rus, giving it an unparalleled moral authority that would resonate for centuries. The ringing of Moscow's church bells now echoed with the spiritual legitimacy of all Russian lands. The decision to move the Metropolitanate was not without its complexities, and historians still debate the exact motivations. Was it purely Peter's personal preference for Moscow's safety, or was there a more active, persuasive role played by Ivan Kalita, perhaps through generous donations or political promises? While the historical record suggests a combination of factors, the outcome was undeniably a massive boon for Moscow, cementing its status as a rising power. Ivan Kalita's successors continued his policies of cautious expansion and shrewd diplomacy. His son, Simeon the Proud, ruled 1340 to 1353, maintained Moscow's favored status with the horde and continued to consolidate power. He too was granted the Yarluk for Vladimir, reinforcing the idea that the Grand Princely title was now intrinsically linked to Moscow. However, the mid-14th century brought a new challenge: the Black Death. The plague swept through Europe and Asia, devastating populations, and Rus was no exception. Moscow, though it suffered, seems to have recovered more quickly than some of its rivals, perhaps due to its growing population and economic resilience. It was under Dmitry Donskoy, who ruled from 1359 to 1389, that Moscow's growing strength would be truly tested. The Mongol Golden Horde, once a monolithic power, began to show cracks. Internal strife, succession disputes, and the rise of ambitious regional khans weakened its central authority. This period, often called the Great Troubles within the Horde, presented an opportunity for the Russian princes, an opportunity Dmitry was ready to seize. Dmitry Donskoy, unlike his predecessors who focused on appeasement, began to subtly challenge Mongol dominance. He refused to pay the full tribute on several occasions, and started to forge alliances with other Russian principalities, uniting them under Moscow's leadership. This shift from submission to defiance was a risky gamble, but one that ultimately paid off. The culmination of this growing resistance came in 1380, at the Battle of Kulikovo Field. This epic confrontation, fought on the vast plains near the Don River, pitted Dmitry Donskoy's united Russian army against the forces of Mamai, a powerful Mongol general who effectively controlled the western part of the Golden Horde. The battle was a brutal, all-day affair, a clash of cultures and wills. Dmitry, showing remarkable personal courage, fought in the thick of the fray, disguised as a common soldier. The Russian victory at Kulikovo was not a final liberation from the Mongol yoke. The horde would return to burn Moscow 2 years later, reminding the Russians of their power. But it was a watershed moment. It shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility and instilled in the Russian people a sense of national unity and a belief that they could, indeed, defeat their oppressors. It was the first major Russian victory against the Mongols in over a century, a beacon of hope in a long night of subjugation. The name Donskoy, meaning of the Don, was bestowed upon Dmitry in honor of this victory. The Battle of Kulikovo Field is often romanticized in Russian history, seen as the moment when the Russian spirit truly awakened. Yet, historians continue to debate its immediate practical impact. While undoubtedly a massive psychologica. La Boost, the Mongol retaliation under Khan Toktamish in 1382, which saw Moscow sacked and burned, demonstrated that the horde still held considerable power. However, the long-term significance of Kulikova is undeniable. It marked the beginning of the end of Mongol domination and firmly established Moscow as the undisputed leader among the Russian principalities, the natural heir to the legacy of Kiev. Following Dmitry Donskoy, Moscow continued its methodical expansion, His son, Vasily I, ruled 1389 to 1425, further consolidated Muscovite power, acquiring more lands and skillfully navigating the complex politics of the decaying Golden Horde. He married the daughter of Vytautas the Great, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, a powerful rival to Moscow, demonstrating a sophisticated approach to foreign policy that combined military strength with strategic alliances. However, the late 14th and early 15th centuries were also marked by a brutal period known as the Muscovite Civil War, or the Feudal War, which lasted for nearly 3 decades, roughly 1425 to 1453. This was a complex and often bloody struggle for the Muscovite throne between Vasily II, Dmitry Donskoy's grandson, and his uncle, Yuri of Zvenigorod, and later Yuri's sons Vasily Kossoy and Dmitry Shemiaka. This internal conflict, sometimes involving blinding and brutal betrayals, threatened to unravel all that Moscow had achieved. It was a period of intense instability, where the very survival of the nascent Muscovite state hung in the balance. Vasily II, known as the Dark because he was blinded by his cousin Dmitry Shemiaka, eventually emerged victorious. Despite his physical disability, he proved to be a remarkably resilient and effective ruler. His triumph over his rivals cemented the principle of primogeniture in Muscovite succession, ensuring a more stable transfer of power in the future. The very fact that Moscow survived such a protracted and violent internal struggle and emerged stronger speaks volumes about the underlying strength and institutional resilience that had been built over generations. By the mid-15th century, the Golden Horde was in terminal decline, fragmenting into smaller, warring khanates. The Mongol grip on Rus was weakening with each passing decade. Moscow, having endured the Mongol yoke for over 2 centuries, was now poised to cast it off completely. The stage was set for the final act of liberation and the emergence of a truly independent Russian state, centered in Moscow. The quiet, cunning diplomacy of its early princes, their patient accumulation of wealth and land, and their eventual courage in challenging the Mongol might had transformed a small, obscure settlement into the undisputed heart of a new Russia. The echoes of their decisions, from the feasts of Yuri Dolgoruki to the battle cries of Dmitry Donskoy, would reverberate through the centuries, shaping the destiny of a vast land. As the golden light of the Mongol sunset began to fade, a new dawn, albeit a slow and often bloody one, was stirring in the fragmented lands of Rus. The devastation wrought by Batu Khan's hordes had left a deep scar. Yet from the ashes, new centers of power began to emerge, vying for influence and, ultimately, for the mantle of leadership. Among these, a principality once considered insignificant, nestled in the dense forests and along the winding Moskva River, began its patient, calculated ascent: Moscow. For generations, Moscow had been a minor player, overshadowed by the grandeur of Vladimir Suzdal or the bustling trade of Novgorod. Its early princes, shrewd and pragmatic, understood the delicate balance of power under the Mongol yoke. They knew that overt defiance was suicide, but quiet accumulation of strength, coupled with strategic diplomacy, could yield surprising results. The early 14th century, particularly under Prince Ivan I, known as Ivan Kalita or Ivan Moneybags, marked a pivotal shift. Kalita was a master of political maneuvering, a man who understood the language of both tribute and alliance. He cultivated a close relationship with the Golden Horde, often acting as their tax collector, a role that, while unpopular with his fellow Rus princes, granted him immense favor and, crucially, a degree of autonomy. This position allowed Kalita to consolidate wealth and expand his territories, often through purchases rather than conquest, a less provocative method in the eyes of the watchful Mongols. He systematically acquired villages and towns, slowly weaving a tapestry of interconnected lands around Moscow. Perhaps more significantly, he convinced the Metropolitan of Kiev, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, to relocate his seat to Moscow in 1326. This was a masterstroke. The Church, a powerful unifying force in Rus, brought not only spiritual authority, but also intellectual and cultural prestige to the burgeoning principality. Moscow, once a backwater, was now the spiritual heart of Rus, a beacon of orthodox faith in a land under foreign dominion. This move, more than any military victory, cemented Moscow's claim to leadership, lending it a moral and religious legitimacy that other principalities struggled to match. The strategic importance of Moscow's geographical location also played a crucial role. Situated at the crossroads of several major river systems, it became a natural hub for trade, even under Mongol rule. Its dense forests offered natural defenses against both Mongol raids and rival Rus princes, allowing it to grow relatively undisturbed while others bore the brunt of conflict. While other cities like Tver initially seemed to possess greater military might or economic clout, Moscow's consistent, long-term strategy of accumulation of land, wealth, and spiritual authority proved more enduring. The princes who followed Kalita continued his policies of expansion and consolidation. They maintained a delicate dance with the Golden Horde, paying tribute diligently while secretly building their own strength. They learned to exploit the internal squabbles and weakening authority within the Golden Horde itself, which by the mid-14th century was beginning to fracture. The Black Death, which swept through Europe and Asia in the mid-1300s, also devastated the Golden Horde, weakening its grip on its vast empire and creating opportunities for its subject peoples. One of Moscow's most celebrated figures, Dmitry Ivanovich, later known as Dmitry Donskoy, would ultimately challenge the Mongol yoke directly. Born in 1350, Dmitry inherited a principality that was already significantly stronger than it had been a century prior. He was a man of piety and courage, deeply committed to the liberation of Rus. The stage for a direct confrontation was set by the growing arrogance and demands of the Mongol overlords, particularly the powerful warlord Mamai, who effectively controlled a large portion of the gold. Horde. Mamai's increasingly heavy hand and his perceived weakness due to internal strife encouraged Dmitry to consider a bolder path. The decisive moment arrived in 1380. Dmitry, having rallied a coalition of Rus princes, though notably not all, marched his army south to confront Mamai. The two forces met on the Kulikova field near the Don River. The battle that ensued on September 8, 1380, was a cataclysmic clash, one of the largest and most brutal engagements of the medieval period. The Rus forces, fighting for their faith and their freedom, faced a larger, more experienced Mongol army. The air would have been thick with the dust of thousands of hooves, the shouts of men, and the clang of steel on steel. The battle raged for hours, a brutal, hand-to-hand struggle that tested the resolve of every man. Dmitry himself fought in the thick of it, disguised as a common soldier to inspire his troops, a detail that historians still debate the veracity of, though it certainly adds to his legend. The Battle of Kulikovo was a turning point, a moment when the seemingly invincible Mongols were, for the first time in over a century, decisively defeated by a united Rus force. The victory was immense, both militarily and psychologically. It shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility and instilled a new sense of hope and national identity among the Rus people. While it did not immediately end Mongol rule, the horde would retaliate fiercely just 2 years later, sacking Moscow in 1382. Kulikovo marked the beginning of the end. It demonstrated that liberation was possible, that a united Rus could stand against its oppressors. The memory of Kulikovo became a powerful symbol, a rallying cry for future generations. The period following Kulikovo was one of continued struggle, but also of accelerating consolidation for Moscow. The Mongol grip, though weakened, was not yet broken. Moscow continued to pay tribute, albeit intermittently, and faced further raids. However, the internal divisions within the Golden Horde deepened, leading to its fragmentation into smaller, warring khanates. This disunity among the Mongols provided Moscow with further opportunities to expand its influence and territory without facing the full, unified might of the Horde. The reigns of Vasily I and Vasily II, Dmitry Donskoy's son and grandson respectively, saw Moscow continue its steady accumulation of power. Vasily I, marrying the daughter of the Grand Duke of Lithuania, established important diplomatic ties, though relations with Lithuania remained complex and often hostile. Vasily II, known as the Dark due to being blinded by rivals during a brutal civil war known as the Muscovite War of Succession, nonetheless managed to emerge victorious, further solidifying Moscow's dominance over other Rus principalities. This civil war, lasting for decades in the mid-15th century, was a testament to the fierce competition for the Grand Princely throne, but Moscow's ultimate triumph underscored its growing strength and resilience. By the mid-15th century, Moscow was undeniably the preeminent power in Rus. Its princes had systematically absorbed or subjugated neighboring principalities, often through a combination of diplomacy, strategic marriages, and military force. The unification process was not always smooth. It involved complex feudal relationships, betrayals, and shifting alliances. Yet the overall trend was clear. The lands of Rus were slowly but surely gathering under the banner of Moscow. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 also had a profound impact on Moscow's trajectory. As the spiritual heir to Byzantium, Moscow began to see itself as the Third Rome, the last bastion of Orthodox Christianity. This idea, though evolving over time, provided a powerful ideological justification for Moscow's expanding power and its role as the protector of the Orthodox faith. It imbued Moscow's secular ambitions with a sacred purpose, elevating its princes from mere territorial rulers to defenders of a universal spiritual heritage. The final break from Mongol rule came under Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great. He ascended to the throne in 1462, inheriting a strong, unified principality. Ivan was a shrewd and ambitious ruler, a true statesman who understood the opportune moment to act. He systematically refused to pay tribute to the Golden Horde, which by this time was a shadow of its former self. Plagued by internal strife and external pressures, the decisive moment arrived in 1480, exactly a century after Kulikovo. Akhmat Khan, the leader of the Great Horde, marched his army north to reassert Mongol authority. Ivan III, however, was prepared. He gathered a large Rus army and marched to meet the Mongols at the Ugra River, a tributary of the Oka. What followed was not a bloody battle like Kulikovo, but a standoff. Famously known as the Great Stand on the Ugra River, for weeks the two armies faced each other across the river, neither side willing to initiate a full-scale attack. The cold autumn winds swept across the plains, perhaps whispering anxieties through both camps. Historians still debate the precise reasons for Akhmat Khan's eventual retreat. Was it the superior defensive position of the Rus army, the onset of winter, or perhaps the fear of a flanking maneuver by Ivan's allies? Regardless of the exact cause, Akhmat Khan, unable to force a crossing or break the Rus' resolve, eventually turned his army around and retreated south. This retreat, without a single major engagement, marked the definitive end of the Tatar yoke, the 2.5-century-long Mongol domination of Rus. The Mongols would never again threaten Moscow or demand tribute. The Great Stand on the Ugra River was a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to such a long and oppressive period. Yet its significance cannot be overstated. It was the culmination of generations of Muscovite policy, of patient accumulation, strategic diplomacy, and the gradual building of military strength and national identity. With the Mongol threat removed, Ivan III was free to fully consolidate the remaining independent Rus lands. He annexed Novgorod in 1478, a city that had maintained a unique republican tradition for centuries, and then Tver in 1485, effectively bringing all of Great Rus under Moscow's direct rule. Ivan the Great's reign transformed Moscow from a powerful principality into a true state, laying the foundations for the future Russian Empire. He adopted the title of Sovereign of all Rus and began to use the double-headed eagle, a symbol of Byzantium, as the state emblem. He married Sophia Paleologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, further reinforcing Moscow's claim as the successor to the fallen Eastern Roman Empire. Under Ivan, the Kremlin was rebuilt with impressive stone fortifications, and Italian architects were brought in to construct magnificent cathedrals and palaces, transforming Moscow into a truly imperial capital. The city, once a humble outpost, now gleamed with the promise of a new era, a testament to the resilience and ambition of its princes. The dream of a unified, independent Rus had finally been realized, forged in the crucible of Mongol subjugation, and refined by the patient, strategic hand of Moscow. The stage was now set for the emergence of a powerful new player on the European and Asian stage, a nation that would forever bear the imprint of its medieval struggles and its hard-won freedom. The Golden Horde, once a terrifying storm sweeping across the Eurasian steppes, began to show the first fissures in its formidable facade. The vast empire, held together by the iron will of its early Khans and the terrifying efficiency of its military, found itself increasingly fractured by internal strife. The vastness that had once been its strength became a sprawling challenge to central authority. Succession disputes, often bloody and brutal, tore at the fabric of the horde from within, creating a kaleidoscope of competing Khans and shifting loyalties. This internal turmoil, simmering for decades, offered a glimmer of hope to the subjugated Russian lands, a faint whisper of a future free from the Tatar yoke. One of the most significant figures to emerge from this period of burgeoning Russian resistance was Dmitry Ivanovich, later known as Dmitry Donskoy, Prince of Moscow. He was a man of both piety and pragmatism, inheriting a principality that, while still tributary to the horde, had grown in strength and influence. Moscow, strategically located and blessed with capable leadership, had become a magnet for refugees and a center of burgeoning Russian identity. Dmitry, born in 1350, ascended to the princely throne at a young age, and his early years were marked by careful diplomacy and a shrewd understanding of the shifting power dynamics both within Russia and with the horde. He understood that outright rebellion was still a dangerous gamble, but he also recognized the growing weakness of his overlords. The stage for a more direct confrontation was set by the rise of Mamai, a powerful Mongol general and regent who, though not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, wielded immense power within the western wing of the Golden Horde. Mamai sought to reassert the horde's fading authority over the Russian principalities with renewed vigor, demanding ever higher tributes and stricter obedience. His ambition, however, was met with Dmitry's increasing defiance. The Russian princes, for generations accustomed to internal squabbles, began to forge a fragile yet potent alliance under Moscow's leadership. Dmitry's diplomatic skill was instrumental in this, convincing wary princes to set aside ancient feuds for a common cause. The culmination of this growing tension arrived in 1380, a year etched into the collective memory of Russia. Mamai, incensed by Dmitry's refusal to pay tribute and his growing independence, assembled a massive army, reportedly numbering in the tens of thousands, a formidable force of Tatar cavalry, Kipchak warriors, and even Genoese mercenaries from the Crimea. His intention was clear: to crush Russian resistance once and for all, and re-establish the undisputed dominance of the Golden Horde. Dmitry, for his part, did not shrink from the challenge. He gathered the combined forces of various Russian principalities, a truly unprecedented display of unity. Chroniclers speak of a deep sense of national purpose, a feeling that this was not merely a battle for tribute, but for the very soul of Russia. Monks blessed the banners, and prayers for victory echoed through the land. The sheer scale of the Russian mobilization was remarkable, drawing men from across the fragmented principalities, all converging on Moscow before marching south to meet the Tatar threat. The two vast armies met on the Kulikovo field, a wide expanse near the Dnieper River, a tributary of the Don. The morning of September the 8th, 1380, dawned misty, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the nervous energy of thousands of men. The battle began with a legendary single combat between a Russian monk warrior named Alexander Peresvet and a Tatar champion, Chelabey. Both men fell, pierced by each other's lances, a symbolic prelude to the bloody struggle that was to follow. The Battle of Kulikovo was a ferocious and prolonged engagement. Mamai's cavalry, renowned for their swift maneuvers and deadly archery, initially pressed the Russian lines hard. The battle raged for hours. The clash of steel, the shouts of men, and the thundering hooves of horses, creating a cacophony of war. The Russian forces, though perhaps less experienced in large-scale cavalry engagements than their Tatar counterparts, fought with a desperate courage, bolstered by their faith and the knowledge that they were fighting for their very survival. The turning point came with a brilliant strategic maneuver by Dmitry. He had concealed a reserve regiment, led by Prince Vladimir of Serpukhov and Dmitry Bobrok, in an oak grove on the flank of the Tatar army. At a critical moment, when Mamai's forces were fully engaged and beginning to exhaust themselves against the main Russian lines, the reserve regiment burst forth from the forest, striking the Tatar flank with devastating force. This unexpected attack threw Mamai's army into disarray. The surprise and the sudden pressure from a fresh force broke their morale. The Tatar lines crumbled, and what had been an orderly advance turned into a panicked rout. Dmitry Donskoy himself fought bravely in the thick of the battle, even exchanging his princely armor for that of a common soldier, a detail that has led some historians to speculate on his motivations. Was it to inspire his troops through personal example, or a shrewd tactic to avoid being targeted by enemy archers? Regardless, he was found after the battle, wounded but alive, under a fallen birch tree. The victory at Kulikovo was resounding. Mamai's army was shattered, and he himself fled, only to be later killed by a rival Khan. Kulikovo did not immediately end the Tatar yoke. Indeed, just 2 years later, in 1382, a new Khan, Toktamish, launched a punitive expedition against Moscow, burning the city to the ground. This devastating raid served as a stark reminder that the Golden Horde, though wounded, was far from defeated. However, Kulikovo was a psychological turning point of immense significance. It demonstrated that the Tatars were not invincible, that a united Russian force could, under the right leadership, defeat them on the battlefield. It instilled a new sense of confidence and national identity among the Russian people. And Moscow's prestige as the leader of the Russian lands soared. It was a beacon of hope in a long, dark night. The century following Kulikovo was a complex tapestry of continued struggle and gradual consolidation of Russian power. The Golden Horde continued its slow, inexorable decline, plagued by further internal strife and the emergence of new, competing Khanates like the Kazan, Astrakhan, and Crimean Khanates. These splintered fragments, while still capable of raiding Russian lands, lacked the unified power and vast resources of the original Golden Horde. Meanwhile, Moscow, under a succession of capable princes, continued to grow in strength, wealth, and territorial control, gradually absorbing or subjugating neighboring principalities. One of these formidable Muscovite princes was Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great. Born in 1440, he ascended to the grand princely throne in 1462. Inheriting a principality that was by then the dominant power in northeastern Russia, Ivan was a shrewd and ambitious ruler, a master of diplomacy and military strategy, who harbored a clear vision of an independent and unified Russian state. He systematically expanded Moscow's territory, incorporating vast lands through a combination of negotiation, purchase, and military conquest. His reign saw the annexation of Novgorod, a powerful and ancient mercantile republic, and Tver, a long-standing rival to Moscow. These acquisitions significantly increased Moscow's resources and manpower, further solidifying its position as the heart of a nascent Russian nation. By the late 15th century, the Golden Horde, once a singular, terrifying entity, had fragmented into several successor states. The Great Horde, as the direct descendant of the Golden Horde, still claimed suzerainty over the Russian lands, B. At its power was a shadow of its former self. Ivan III, sensing the opportune moment, began to openly challenge its authority, gradually reducing the tribute payments and asserting his independence in increasingly bold ways. The final, decisive confrontation, though surprisingly bloodless, came in 1480, exactly a century after Kulikovo. This event is known as the Great Stand on the Ugra River. Khan Akhmat, the ruler of the Great Horde, assembled a large army and marched towards Moscow, intending to reassert Tatar dominance and punish Ivan for his defiance. Ivan, in turn, gathered his own forces, which by this time were well organized and equipped, and marched south to meet the threat. The two armies met along the Ugra River, a natural barrier that separated their forces. For weeks, the armies stood facing each other across the river, a tense and eerie standoff. Neither side seemed willing to initiate a full-scale battle. The autumn weather grew colder, and the river began to freeze. The Russian forces under Ivan's command were well positioned and prepared for a defensive engagement. Ivan, ever the pragmatist, was also engaged in diplomatic maneuvers, attempting to secure alliances and sow discord within Akhmat's camp. Historians still debate the precise reasons for the prolonged standoff and the eventual outcome. Some argue that Ivan was deliberately delaying, hoping for the onset of winter to weaken the Tatar forces, who were less accustomed to fighting in harsh conditions. Others suggest that Akhmat, having heard of the strength of the Russian army and the strategic advantage of their defensive positions, was hesitant to risk a direct assault, perhaps remembering the lessons of Kulikovo. There is also the theory that Akhmat was waiting for reinforcements from his Lithuanian allies, who never arrived. The psychological warfare played a significant role, with both sides engaging in skirmishes and probing attacks, but avoiding a full-scale engagement. As the weeks turned into months and the harsh Russian winter began to set in, the situation became increasingly untenable for Akhmat's army. Their supplies dwindled, and the prospect of fighting a prolonged campaign in freezing temperatures, far from their traditional lands, grew ever more daunting. Finally, in late October or early November, without a single major battle having been fought, Khan Akhmat made the fateful decision to retreat. He turned his army around and marched back towards the steppe. This retreat, while seemingly anticlimactic, was profoundly significant. It marked the definitive end of the Tatar yoke over Russia. Akhmat's retreat was not just a tactical withdrawal. It was an acknowledgement of the Great Horde's diminished power and Russia's newfound strength. The news of Akhmat's retreat was met with immense relief and celebration in Moscow and across the Russian lands. It was a moment of profound liberation, the culmination of nearly 250 years of subjugation. The Great Stand on the Ugra River, though lacking the dramatic bloodshed of Kulikovo, was the symbolic and practical end of an era. It solidified Moscow's position as the undisputed center of the Russian lands, and paved the way for the emergence of a truly independent and unified Russian state. The year 1480 is often cited as the official date for the end of the Tatar yoke, a pivotal moment in the formation of the Russian nation. The aftermath of the Great Stand saw the rapid disintegration of the Great Horde. Khan Akhmat was killed shortly after his retreat by a rival Khan, and his once formidable state splintered further. eventually ceasing to exist as a significant power. While the Crimean Khanate, a successor state, would continue to pose a threat to Russia for centuries, raiding its southern borders and even sacking Moscow in 1571, the era of direct Mongol suzerainty over the Russian principalities was irrevocably over. The long struggle against the Golden Horde profoundly shaped Russian identity, political structures, and even its cultural development. The period of Tatar rule, often seen as a dark age, also inadvertently contributed to the rise of Moscow. The Khans, in their efforts to maintain control, often favored Moscow over other principalities, granting its princes the right to collect tribute from other Russian lands, thereby strengthening its economic and political power. The need for a strong, centralized authority to resist the external threat also contributed to the development of autocratic rule in Russia, a characteristic that would define its political landscape for centuries to come. The legacy of the Golden Horde and its eventual overthrow echoes through Russian history, celebrated in chronicles, folk tales, and later in art and literature. It instilled a deep-seated sense of resilience and a powerful narrative of national liberation. The memory of the Yoke served as a powerful unifying force, shaping the collective consciousness of a people who had endured centuries of foreign domination and emerged, at last, free and poised to forge their own destiny on the vast Eurasian plain. The quiet retreat from the Ugra, though less dramatic than the clash at Kulikovo, was the final, decisive whisper of a new dawn for Russia, the dawn that promised independence and the boundless horizons of a burgeoning empire. The flickering lamplight of the Kremlin, now more than just a wooden palisade, cast long shadows across the snow-dusted courtyards. It was here, within these growing stone walls, that a new vision for Rus began to solidify under the steady hand of Ivan III, known to history as Ivan the Great. Born in 1440, Ivan's reign, spanning from 1462 to 1505, would prove to be a pivotal epoch, marking the true emergence of a unified Russian state from the fragmented mosaic of principalities. The air, once thick with the scent of pine and fear of Tatar raids, now carried the subtle aroma of ambition and the promise of a sovereign future. Ivan inherited a Muscovy that, while powerful, was still surrounded by rivals and beholden, at least nominally, to the Golden Horde. His father, Vasily II, had laid much of the groundwork for consolidation, but it was Ivan who possessed the strategic genius and unwavering resolve to complete the task. He was a man of quiet determination, often described as cautious and calculating, yet capable of decisive action when the moment demanded it. Unlike the fiery princes of old, Ivan preferred diplomacy and political maneuvering to outright warfare, though he was certainly not averse to military campaigns when persuasion failed. One of his earliest and most significant achievements was the absorption of Novgorod, the ancient mercantile republic that had long prided itself on its independence and its unique veche, or assembly, system of governance. Novgorod, with its vast northern territories stretching to the White Sea and its rich trade networks, represented a formidable prize. Ivan understood that as long as Novgorod remained a separate entity, Muscovy's claim to be the sole unifier of Rus would be incomplete. The struggle was not merely one of territory, but of ideology, Muscovite autocracy versus Novgorodian republicanism. The first major confrontation came in 1471. Novgorod, feeling increasingly threatened by Moscow's expansion, sought an alliance with Lithuania, a move that Ivan interpreted as a betrayal of Orthodox unity and a direct challenge to his authority. He launched a swift and devastating campaign, culminating in the Battle of Shelon River. Though details of the battle itself are somewhat sparse, Muscovite forces, under the command of Prince Danil Homsky, decisively defeated the larger Novgorodian militia. This victory severely weakened Novgorod, but Ivan, ever the pragmatist, did not immediately annex it. Instead, he imposed a heavy indemnity and curtailed some of its independent powers, allowing it to retain a semblance of self-rule for a few more years. However, the seeds of complete absorption had been sown. By 1478, Ivan decided the time was ripe. He marched on Novgorod again, this time with the clear intention of ending its independence for good. After a relatively short siege, the city surrendered. Ivan dismantled the Veche bell, the symbol of Novgorodian self-governance, and had it transported to Moscow, a powerful symbolic gesture signifying the end of an era and the triumph of Muscovite centralized power. He confiscated vast lands from the Novgorodian boyars and merchants, redistributing them to his own loyal servitors, thus integrating the region firmly into the Muscovite system. This act of consolidation, though often brutal in its execution, was a crucial step in forging a single Russian state. Historians still debate the extent to which Novgorod's wealthy merchant class actively resisted or simply succumbed to Moscow's superior military and political pressure. Some argue that internal divisions within Novgorod itself, particularly between the wealthy elite and the common people, weakened its ability to resist effectively. With Novgorod secured, Ivan turned his attention to other independent principalities. Tver, another historically significant and powerful rival, was next. 1485, after a period of diplomatic maneuvering and military pressure, Ivan annexed Tver, bringing its lands and resources under direct Muscovite control. This pattern of annexation, often achieved through a combination of intimidation, strategic alliances, and occasional military force, continued throughout his reign. Yaroslavl, Rostov, and other smaller principalities gradually lost their autonomy, their ruling families either submitting to Moscow or being absorbed into the Muscovite service nobility. But perhaps Ivan's most enduring legacy was his role in finally casting off the Tatar yoke. For over 2 centuries, the various Rus principalities had paid tribute to the Golden Horde, a constant reminder of their subjugation. By Ivan's time, the Golden Horde itself had fragmented into several smaller khanates, the most prominent being the Great Horde, the Kazan Khanate, and the Crimean Khanate. Ivan, with his strengthened Muscovite state, was increasingly unwilling to tolerate this humiliating tribute. In 1480, the decisive moment arrived. Ahmed Khan of the Great Horde, seeking to reassert his authority, marched his forces towards Muscovy. Ivan, though initially hesitant and even reportedly fleeing Moscow for a time, eventually gathered his forces and met the Tatars at the Ugra River. What followed was not a pitched battle, but a prolonged standoff, known as the Great Stand on the Ugra River. For weeks, the two armies faced each other across the river, neither willing to initiate a full-scale attack. The autumn chill deepened, and the first snows began to fall. Legend has it that Ivan was initially reluctant to engage, perhaps recalling the devastating defeats of earlier princes. His mother, Grand Princess Maria, and his spiritual advisor, Metropolitan Gerontius, are said to have urged him to stand firm. As winter approached, the Tatars, facing dwindling supplies and the prospect of fighting in harsh conditions, began to withdraw. Ivan's forces, though not engaging in direct combat, had effectively deterred the horde. This bloodless victory was a monumental turning point. It signaled the definitive end of Tatar overlordship over Muscovy, freeing the nascent Russian state from centuries of foreign domination. The psychological impact was immense. Rus was finally free, and Ivan was hailed as the liberator. This event, though lacking the drama of a great battle, was perhaps more profound in its implications, marking the true birth of a sovereign Russian state. With independence secured and territories consolidated, Ivan began to cultivate an imperial ideology. He married Sophia Palaiologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, in 1472. This marriage was far more than a personal union. It was a profound political and symbolic act. Sophia brought with her not only a connection to the imperial lineage of Byzantium, but also a rich cultural heritage. She is often credited with introducing Byzantine court rituals, double-headed eagle symbolism, and the idea of Moscow as the Third Rome, the successor to Rome and Constantinople, as the center of Orthodox Christianity and imperial power. This concept, though fully articulated by later ideologues, began to take root during Ivan's reign, providing a powerful ideological foundation for Muscovy's future expansion and its claim to be the protector of orthodoxy. The influence of Sophia and the Byzantine connection extended to architecture and court life. Ivan invited Italian architects, most notably Aristotele Fioravanti, to Moscow. Fioravanti's masterpiece, the Dormition Cathedral, Ouspensky Sobor, within the Kremlin, completed in 1479, became the coronation church for Russian monarchs and a symbol of Muscovite power and spiritual authority. Its grand scale and sophisticated construction techniques were a testament to the new ambitions of the state. Other Italian masters, like Marco Ruffo and Pietro Antonio Solari, contributed to the construction of new Kremlin walls, towers, and palaces, transforming the former wooden fortress into a formidable stone citadel befitting an empire. The Kremlin, under Ivan, became a dazzling display of power, a blend of traditional Russian and imported European architectural styles, a silent testament to the grandeur he envisioned for his realm. Ivan also undertook significant legal reforms. In 1497, he issued the Sudebnik, a new code of laws that standardized legal procedures across Muscovy. This code was a crucial step towards creating a unified legal system, replacing the disparate local customs and laws that had prevailed in the various principalities. It regulated judicial processes, established uniform penalties, and importantly, restricted the peasants' right to move from one lord to another, a measure that would gradually lead to the full encirclement of the peasantry in later centuries. The Sudebnik represented a conscious effort to centralize power, not just militarily and politically, but also judicially, laying the groundwork for a more ordered and controlled society. The expansion of Muscovy's borders under Ivan was truly remarkable. By the end of his reign, the territory under Moscow's direct control had more than tripled. He pushed the western borders towards the Baltic, engaging in wars with Lithuania and the Livonian Order, though these campaigns were often protracted and yielded mixed results. To the east, Muscovite influence expanded into the Perm region and beyond. solidifying control over vital fur trade routes. The sheer scale of this territorial growth was unprecedented for a single reign, creating a vast and diverse state that was beginning to resemble the Russia we know today. Ivan's reign also saw the beginnings of a more sophisticated state administration. He established a system of prikazy, or government departments, to manage various aspects of state affairs. From foreign relations to military organization and financial administration. While these were not yet fully developed bureaucratic institutions, they represented an important step towards a more centralized and efficient governance. He relied heavily on a loyal service nobility, granting them lands, pomesti, in exchange for military and administrative service, thus creating a powerful class directly dependent on the Grand Prince. This system, while strengthening the central authority, also laid the foundations for future social stratification and tensions. Despite his numerous successes, Ivan was not without his challenges. The issue of succession, a perennial problem in medieval monarchies, caused him considerable anxiety. His first son, Ivan the Young, died in 1490, leading to a complex succession dispute between his grandson, Dmitry, and his second son, Vasily. This internal family struggle, known as the succession crisis of the 1490s, involved court intrigues, accusations of heresy, and political maneuvering. Initially, Ivan crowned Dmitry as co-ruler, but later, under the influence of Sophia and her supporters, he imprisoned Dmitry and his mother, Helena, and named Vasily as his heir. This episode, though a dark stain on his otherwise brilliant reign, underscored the absolute power he wielded and his determination to secure the succession according to his own will. The exact reasons for Ivan's change of heart regarding Dmitry remain a subject of historical debate, with some scholars pointing to political factions and others to religious disputes involving the Judaizers' heresy. Ivan the Great died in 1505, leaving behind a vastly transformed Muscovy. He had inherited a regional power and bequeathed a nascent empire. His reign marked the decisive shift from the fragmented principalities of Rus to a unified, independent, and ambitious Russian state. He had not only thrown off the Tatar yoke, but had also laid the administrative, legal, and ideological foundations for future Tsars to build upon. The quiet, calculating Grand Prince, who rarely led his armies into battle, but masterfully orchestrated their victories, had forever altered the course of Russian history. His legacy was etched in the stone walls of the Kremlin, in the new laws that governed his vast lands, and in the very idea of a sovereign Russia, a powerful Orthodox empire, looking both to its Byzantine past and its European future. The air in Moscow, once heavy with the echoes of distant hoofbeats, now resonated with the confident pronouncements of a burgeoning imperial court. The vast, cold lands of Rus were now united under a single crown, a crown that would soon transform into a glittering, fearsome symbol of absolute power. The Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan IV, was no longer content with the old titles. He yearned for something grander, something that echoed the majesty of Byzantium and the ancient Roman emperors. In 1547, at the tender age of 16, Ivan was crowned not as Grand Prince, but as Tsar of all Rus. This audacious act, performed in the Dormition Cathedral of the Moscow Kremlin, marked a pivotal moment. The term Tsar derived from Caesar, a deliberate link to the imperial legacy of Rome and Constantinople, asserting Russia's new status as the rightful heir to Orthodox Christian leadership after the fall of Byzantium. With this coronation, the Muscovite state officially became the Tsardom of Russia, a name that would resonate for centuries to come. Ivan's early reign, often referred to as the Good Period, was marked by ambitious reforms and a genuine desire to strengthen and modernize his nascent empire. He surrounded himself with a council of trusted advisors, known as the Chosen Council, who helped him implement significant changes. One of his most enduring legacies was the creation of the Zemsky Sobor, a national assembly that included representatives from various social classes, from boyars to merchants and even state peasants. While not the true parliament in the Western sense, it was an important step towards consolidating power and gaining broader support for his policies. The Zemsky Sobor of 1549, for instance, played a crucial role in codifying a new legal system, the Sudebnik of 1550, which replaced the outdated laws of 1497. This new code aimed to reduce corruption, standardize judicial procedures, and improve the administration of justice across the vast territories. Beyond legal reforms, Ivan also turned his attention to military organization. He recognized the need for a standing army but was loyal to the Tsar, rather than relying solely on the often unreliable boyar militias. He established the Streltsy, an elite corps of musketeers who were equipped with firearms and received regular pay. These professional soldiers, with their distinctive uniforms and formidable weaponry, became a cornerstone of the Russian army and played a vital role in Ivan's subsequent military campaigns. He also reformed local government, replacing appointed governors with locally elected officials, a move intended to curb the power of the boyars and improve administrative efficiency. These early years painted a picture of a thoughtful, if intense, young ruler, dedicated to the prosperity and strength of his realm. Yet, beneath this veneer of reform and progress, a darker current stirred within Ivan. His childhood had been fraught with instability and betrayal. Orphaned at a young age, he had witnessed the ruthless power struggles among the boyar factions, who often treated him with disdain and neglect. These early experiences, coupled with a naturally volatile temperament, sowed seeds of paranoia and distrust that would later blossom into a reign of terror. The death of his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, in 1560 was a turning point. Ivan suspected she had been poisoned by the boyars, and his grief spiraled into an all-consuming rage. He began to view all boyars as potential traitors, plotting against his throne and his life. The first major manifestation of Ivan's growing paranoia was his dramatic abdication. In 1564, he suddenly left Moscow with his family and a retinue of loyal followers, settling in the village of Alexandrovskaya Sloboda. From there, he sent 2 letters to Moscow, one to the Metropolitan and the boyars, accusing them of corruption and treason, and another to the common people, assuring them of his continued favor. The people, fearing a return to boyar rule and chaos, begged him to return. Ivan, seizing the opportunity to consolidate absolute power, agreed, but on his own terms. He demanded the right to punish traitors as he saw fit, confiscate their lands, and establish a special territory under his direct control, free from the interference of the boyars or the church. This was the birth of the oprichnina. The oprichnina, established in 1565, was a state within a state, a terrifying personal domain ruled solely by Ivan. He divided Russia into 2 parts, the oprichnina directly controlled by the Tsar, and the Zemshina, governed by the boyars. The oprichnina lands were often the most fertile and strategically important, and their former owners were forcibly relocated, their properties seized. To enforce his will, Ivan created the oprichniki, a fearsome personal guard whose loyalty was solely to him. These black-clad horsemen, carrying a dog's head and a broom attached to their saddles, symbols of sniffing out and sweeping away treason, became the instruments of Ivan's terror. Their methods were brutal and indiscriminate. They executed, tortured, and exiled thousands, often without trial, targeting not only boyars, but also ordinary citizens, priests, and even entire towns. The oprichnina was a period of unprecedented state-sponsored terror, designed to break the power of the old aristocracy and solidify the Tsar's autocratic rule. One of the most infamous episodes was the devastation of Novgorod in 1570. Ivan, suspecting the wealthy city of plotting to defect to Lithuania, marched his oprichniki upon it. For weeks, the city was subjected to systematic looting, torture, and mass executions. Chronicles describe thousands of citizens being drowned in the Volkhov River, their bodies piled high. The prosperous city, once a vibrant center of trade and culture, was left in ruins. Its population decimated. Historians still debate the exact number of victims during the oprichnina, with estimates ranging from a few thousand to tens of thousands. The lack of precise records and the deliberate destruction of evidence make it difficult to ascertain the full scale of the horror. But its impact on Russian society was profound and long-lasting. Beyond internal purges, Ivan's reign was also marked by extensive military campaigns aimed at expanding Russia's borders. His most significant early triumph was the conquest of the Kazan Khanate in 1552. This strategically important Tatar state, a remnant of the Golden Horde, had long been a thorn in Russia's side, launching raids into Russian territory. Ivan personally led the siege of Kazan, employing advanced siege techniques, including the use of sappers to undermine the city walls with gunpowder. The fall of Kazan was a monumental victory, opening up the Volga River for Russian trade and paving the way for further expansion eastward. 4 years later, in 1556, the Astrakhan Khanate, located at the mouth of the Volga on the Caspian Sea, also fell to Russian forces, securing Russia's control over the entire Volga waterway and providing access to trade routes with Persia and Central Asia. These conquests were celebrated with the construction of the iconic St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, a breathtaking masterpiece of Russian architecture, commissioned by Ivan to commemorate the capture of Kazan. Its vibrant domes and intricate designs stand as a testament to the artistic and religious fervor of the era, even as the shadows of the oprichnina began to lengthen. However, Ivan's military ambitions were not always successful. His long and costly Livonian War, 1558 to 1583, proved to be a disastrous miscalculation. Ivan sought to gain access to the Baltic Sea and secure vital trade routes to Western Europe by conquering Livonia, modern-day Estonia and Latvia, then controlled by the Livonian Order. The war dragged on for 25 years, drawing Russia into conflict with a coalition of powerful European states, including Sweden, Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark. The war drained Russia's resources, decimated its population, and ultimately ended in a humiliating defeat, with Russia losing territory and failing to achieve its primary objective. The war's prolonged nature and the immense human and economic cost undoubtedly contributed to Ivan's increasing instability and brutality. The oprichnina initially conceived as a tool to consolidate power, ultimately proved to be a destructive force that weakened the very state it was meant to strengthen. The arbitrary executions and confiscations of land led to widespread social unrest and economic devastation. Many skilled artisans, merchants, and landowners fled the country or were killed, leaving vast swathes of land uncultivated and trade disrupted. The power vacuum created by the elimination of many old boyar families did not lead to a more stable government, but rather to a climate of fear and uncertainty. The oprichnina was formally abolished in 1572, but its psychological scars and the institutionalization of state terror would linger for generations. Ivan's personal life was as tumultuous as his reign. He married multiple times, often after the deaths of his previous wives, and his relationships were frequently marked by tragedy and violence. His most infamous act of personal brutality occurred in 1581, when, in a fit of rage, he struck his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, with his scepter, inflicting a fatal head wound. The death of his capable and beloved son plunged Ivan into deep despair and left the less competent Fyodor as his successor, a decision that would have grave consequences for the future of Russia. This tragic incident, often depicted in art and literature, underscores the destructive nature of Ivan's uncontrolled fury. Despite his brutality, Ivan IV was a complex figure. He was a highly educated and intelligent ruler, well-versed in theology and history. He was a prolific writer, engaging in extensive correspondence with foreign rulers and even penning religious texts. He encouraged the development of printing in Russia, establishing the first printing press in Moscow in 1553, which produced important religious and educational works. He was also a devout, albeit superstitious, Orthodox Christian, spending hours in prayer and engaging in acts of penance, even as he ordered horrific atrocities. This paradox, the intellectual and the tyrant, the devout and the depraved, continues to fascinate and confound historians. The legacy of Ivan the Terrible is one of profound contradictions. He was the architect of the Russian Tsardom, expanding its territory and consolidating its power, laying the foundations for the future Russian Empire. He was a reformer who modernized the legal system and military, yet he also unleashed a reign of terror that decimated his own people and left a lasting scar on the Russian psyche. His actions set a precedent for autocratic rule that would shape Russian governance for centuries. The oprichnina, in particular, established a chilling model of state-sponsored violence and surveillance that would reappear in later periods of Russian history. When Ivan IV died in 1584, likely from a stroke, he left behind a vast, but deeply troubled, empire. His death marked the end of the Rurikid dynasty's direct male line, as his successor, Fyodor I, was a weak and sickly ruler. Fyodor's childless death in 1598 plunged Russia into the time of troubles, a period of profound political instability, famine, and foreign intervention that nearly brought the young Tsardom to its knees. The seeds of this chaos, arguably, were sown during Ivan's reign, as his purges had eliminated many capable leaders and his wars had exhausted the nation. The image of Ivan the Terrible, as he came to be known, remains etched in Russian history, a figure of immense power and terrifying cruelty, a monarch who both built and nearly destroyed his nascent empire. His reign, with its blend of ambitious reform and horrifying brutality, serves as a stark reminder of the destructive potential of unchecked power and the enduring complexities of human nature. The whispers of his terror still echo through the grand halls of the Kremlin, a chilling counterpoint to the vibrant domes of St. Basil's, a testament to the dark heart of a ruler who sought to forge an empire through fear and blood. The grand, often terrifying reign of Ivan IV, the first Tsar of all Russia, had finally drawn to a close in March of 1584. His last years had been shadowed by paranoia, the Oprichnina's brutal legacy, and the devastating Livonian War, which had bled the treasury and the populace dry. When he died, ostensibly from a stroke while playing chess, he left behind a kingdom teetering on the brink of chaos, a dynasty weakened by his own hand, and a succession crisis that would plunge Russia into one of its darkest periods, the Time of Troubles. His eldest surviving son, Fyodor I, ascended to the throne. Fyodor was a pious, gentle soul, more inclined to prayer and contemplation than the harsh realities of governance. Chroniclers often described him as simple-minded or even mentally infirm, though modern historians suggest he may have suffered from a mild intellectual disability or perhaps a profound disinterest in worldly power. Whatever the truth, it was clear that Fyodor was not suited to rule the vast, complex, and volatile Muscovite state. The true power behind the throne quickly consolidated in the hands of his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, a shrewd and ambitious boyar who had risen through the ranks during Ivan's reign. Boris Godunov, a man of Tatar descent, possessed a keen political mind and a strong will, qualities Fyodor lacked entirely. He effectively became the de facto ruler, guiding state affairs, reforming the administration, and even attempting to establish a patriarchate in Moscow, elevating the Russian Orthodox Church to a status independent of Constantinople in 1589. This was a significant diplomatic and religious achievement, bolstering Russia's prestige on the international stage. Yet, despite his capable governance, Boris faced a persistent challenge to his legitimacy. He was not of Rurikid blood, and the old boyar families resented his meteoric rise. Whispers of his ambition and the means he might have employed to secure his power began to circulate. The most enduring and damaging of these whispers concerned Dmitry Ivanovich, Ivan the Terrible's youngest son, Fyodor's half-brother. Dmitry, a child of about 8, was living in internal exile in Uglich with his mother, Maria Nagaya, Ivan's 7th wife. In May of 1591, Dmitry died under mysterious circumstances. The official report stated he had suffered an epileptic seizure while playing with a knife and accidentally cut his own throat. However, the Nagaya family immediately accused Boris Godunov of orchestrating the boy's murder to remove a potential rival to the throne. The bells of Uglich tolled in alarm, and a local uprising ensued, swiftly and brutally suppressed. Historians still vigorously debate the true cause of Dmitry's death. Was it a tragic accident, a case of self-inflicted injury during a seizure, as the official investigation concluded? Or was it indeed an assassination, a dark stain on Boris Godunov's ascent to power? The lack of definitive evidence, coupled with the political climate of the time, has allowed both theories to persist. The ambiguity surrounding Dmitry's demise would haunt Boris Godunov's reign and become a rallying cry for future pretenders. Regardless of the truth, the popular belief that Boris had murdered the Tsarevich deeply undermined his authority and sowed seeds of distrust among the populace. When Tsar Fyodor I died childless in 1598, the Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 7 centuries, came to an end. This left a power vacuum of unprecedented scale. The Zemsky Sobor, an assembly of nobles, clergy and merchants, elected Boris Godunov as the new Tsar. He accepted, but his reign was immediately plagued by misfortune. A series of devastating crop failures between 1601 and 1603 led to widespread famine, killing perhaps a third of the population in some regions. The suffering was immense, and popular discontent soared. Many saw these calamities as divine punishment for Boris's alleged sins, a sign that God did not approve of his rule. In this atmosphere of despair and political instability, a new figure emerged from the shadows. A man claiming to be the miraculously escaped Tsarevich Dmitry Ivanovich. This impostor, later known as False Dmitry I, appeared in Poland in 1603. His true identity remains a subject of historical speculation, though many believe him to have been a runaway monk named Grigory Otlepiev. He was charismatic, intelligent, and possessed a remarkable resemblance to the late Tsarevich, or at least enough of the resemblance to convince many who were eager to believe. He gained the support of Polish magnates who saw an opportunity to extend their influence into Russia, and even the Polish king Sigismund III Vasa, who provided him with troops and resources. False Dmitry's invasion of Russia in 1604, initially with a small force, gained momentum as he marched eastward. Disaffected peasants, Cossacks, and even some Russian nobles, disillusioned with Boris Godunov and suffering from the famine, flocked to his banner. They believed they were fighting for the legitimate heir, for justice against a usurper. Boris Godunov, already struggling with internal dissent and a weakened military, found himself facing an existential threat. He died suddenly in April 1605, possibly of a stroke, leaving his young son Fedor II to inherit a crumbling throne. Fedor II's reign was tragically short. Within weeks, False Dmitry I entered Moscow in triumph, acclaimed by the populace as the true Tsar. Fedor II and his mother were brutally murdered, and False Dmitry was crowned Tsar in July 1605. He proved to be an energetic and ambitious ruler, attempting reforms and showing an interest in Western culture. However, his reliance on Polish allies, his Catholic sympathies, real or perceived, and his disdain for some traditional Russian customs alienated the powerful boyars and the Orthodox Church. His marriage to Marina Mnisek, a Polish Catholic noblewoman, and the subsequent lavish, foreign-style wedding further inflamed nationalist and religious sentiments. Within less than a year, a boyar conspiracy led by Vasily Shweisky, a descendant of the Rurikids, orchestrated a coup. False Dmitry I was murdered in May 1606, his body mutilated and publicly displayed. Vasily Shweisky, a cunning and ruthless politician, then proclaimed himself Tsar Vasily IV. His rule, however, was immediately challenged. The belief in Dmitry's survival was strong, and soon new pretenders emerged. The most significant of these was False Dmitry II, who appeared in 1607. His origins are even more obscure than his predecessors. But he too gathered a formidable army of Poles, Cossacks, and disaffected Russians. He established a rival court in Tushino, near Moscow, earning him the moniker the Fief of Tushino. For a time, Russia effectively had 2 Tsars, 2 capitals, and 2 warring factions. The time of troubles deepened into a full-blown civil war, exacerbated by foreign intervention. Sweden, seeking to capitalize on Russia's weakness, invaded in the north, while Poland, under King Sigismund III, launched a full-scale invasion aiming to place his son, Prince Władysław, on the Russian throne. Tsar Vasily IV, desperate, made a fateful alliance with Sweden, promising territory in exchange for military aid. This only provoked Poland further. In 1610, Vasily IV was overthrown by the boyars, who, in their desperation, offered the Russian throne to Prince Władysław of Poland, hoping to end the chaos and restore order. A Polish garrison occupied the Moscow Kremlin. This period, from 1610 to 1612, was perhaps the darkest hour of the time of troubles. Russia was without a Tsar, its capital occupied by a foreign power, and its lands ravaged by war, famine, and brigandage. The idea of a Catholic Polish prince on the Russian Orthodox throne was deeply offensive to many, especially the Church. It was this threat to Russian national and religious identity that finally galvanized a popular resistance. From the cities of Nizhny Novgorod and Yaroslavl, a powerful patriotic movement began to form. Kuzma Minin, a merchant from Nizhny Novgorod, rallied the local population, calling for donations and volunteers to raise a national militia. Prince Dmitry Pozharsky, a respected military leader, was chosen to command this new army. In 1612, this volunteer army marched towards Moscow, slowly gathering strength and support. Their advance was a testament to the resilience of the Russian people, a spontaneous outpouring of national will in the face of utter collapse. The militia, united by a fierce devotion to orthodoxy and a desire to expel the foreign invaders, laid siege to the Polish garrison in the Kremlin. After months of desperate fighting and starvation, the Polish forces surrendered in October 1612. Moscow was liberated, and the immediate foreign threat was repelled. The long, agonizing time of troubles was finally drawing to a close, but the nation was exhausted, its infrastructure shattered, and its population decimated. With Moscow liberated, the immediate task was to elect a new Tsar and restore legitimate rule. In January 1613, a new Zemsky Sobor was convened, perhaps the largest and most representative in Russian history. After much deliberation, the assembly chose Mikhail Romanov, a 16-year-old boy, as the new Tsar. Mikhail was the son of Fyodor Ivanovich, later Patriarch Filaret, a prominent boyar and church leader who had been a relative of Ivan the Terrible's first wife, Anastasia Romanovna. This distant connection to the old Rurikid dynasty, combined with his youth and the general exhaustion of the warring factions, made him an acceptable compromise candidate. He was seen as a neutral figure, untainted by the bloody struggles of the preceding decades. Mikhail Romanov's election marked the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, which would rule Russia for over 3 centuries. His reign, and the reigns of his immediate successors, were largely dedicated to restoring order, rebuilding the shattered economy, and consolidating central authority. The initial years were challenging, with lingering Polish and Swedish incursions, but gradually stability returned. The establishment of the Romanov dynasty marked a definitive end to the medieval period of Russian history, ushering in an era of gradual modernization and expansion that would see Russia emerge as a major European power. The scars of the time of troubles, however, would remain etched in the national memory, a stark reminder of the fragility of power and the resilience of a people.